The porch boards creaked as I rocked in my chair. It had been 2 weeks since we buried Grandpa Thomas. His absence felt weird, like something important was just gone. I took a deep breath of the cool Colorado evening air, smelling pine and damp earth from the rain earlier. 3 generations of Hayes family rangers. I still felt proud about that, even while grieving. My grandfather, my father, and now me, we all worked at Rocky Mountain National Park. Growing up, I heard all their stories about bears, lost hikers, and crazy winter storms. But there was one story they never told. Uncle Bobby. I only knew him from old photos, a 10-year-old kid with blue eyes just like mine. He died long before I was born. Dad got the full story when he turned 18, but kept it to himself. I didn't ask questions. I heard an engine and looked up. Dad's truck pulled into my gravel driveway. He parked next to my Ranger truck and just sat there for a minute, hands on the wheel. When he got out, he looked really tired. His face seemed older than it had at the funeral 2 weeks ago. "Hey," I called as he climbed the steps. "Got any coffee?" he asked, voice thick with something I couldn't name. I nodded and went inside to put the kettle on. When I returned with 2 steaming mugs, Dad had settled into the chair beside mine. The mountains stood tall against the darkening sky. We sat in comfortable silence, sipping our coffee as night approached. Crickets began their evening chorus. "It's time you knew about Bobby," Dad said, his voice barely audible over the insects. I set my mug down carefully on the small table between us. "Okay." Dad reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an old photograph. He handed it to me without meeting my eyes. The picture showed a smiling boy standing next to Grandpa Thomas, who looked impossibly young. They wore hiking gear and stood at a trailhead I didn't recognize. Bobby held a collection of pine cones in one small hand. "Your grandfather made me promise to tell you after he was gone," Dad said. He pulled a flask from his pocket, unscrewed the cap, and poured a generous amount into his coffee. He offered it to me, but I shook my head. This isn't the kind of story I can tell sober. The first stars appeared overhead, tiny points of light in the deepening blue. I pulled my jacket tighter as the temperature dropped. Whatever this story was, it had carved itself into my family's history. I could tell by the way Dad's hands trembled slightly as he raised his mug for another sip. I could see it in the new lines around his eyes that hadn't been there a month ago. "I'm ready," I said. Dad took a deep breath and looked out at the mountains. The forest spread out before us, miles of trees and hidden valleys. I had always loved these woods, had always felt at peace among the trails and streams. But as Dad turned back to me, I could see years of hidden pain in his eyes. I knew that after tonight, I would never look at the wilderness the same way again. "It happened in 1957, Dad began, and his voice carried me back to a time before I existed, to a tragedy that had haunted our family for generations. I leaned forward in my chair. The coffee in my mug had gone cold while Dad talked about the past. "Your grandfather took Bobby to Pike National Forest that October. Thomas wanted to set up some hunting cameras, part research, part hobby. He had this idea about tracking animal migration patterns." Dad took another sip from his flask-spiked coffee. The mountains disappeared in the dark now, leaving only the vague outline of their massive shapes against the night sky. I closed my eyes, trying to picture my grandfather as a younger man, with his son beside him. Thomas always said the autumn air felt different that year, clearer somehow, like every scent came through sharper. The aspens had already turned, all gold against the evergreens. Bobby couldn't contain himself. He kept running ahead on the trail. Dad's voice got softer when he talked about the uncle I never knew. I could tell he was still hurt about it, even though it happened so long ago. Bobby collected pine cones, had a whole system for which ones were worth keeping. He spotted a fox, 2 mule deer, and even claimed he saw a black bear, though Thomas said it was probably just a shadow. Thomas kept calling him back over and over. "He ran too far ahead?" I asked, breaking my silence. Dad shook his head. "Not exactly. Thomas was using it as a teaching moment, the Hayes family lesson. Respect the wilderness and its dangers. The same one he taught me. The same one I taught you. I nodded, remembering all the times Dad had insisted I stay within calling distance on our hikes when I was young. By mid-afternoon, they reached a clearing next to Eagle River. Thomas was tired of shouting for Bobby to stay close, so he let the boy play near the water while he set up their camp. Bobby spent an hour just tossing stones, trying to make them skip across the surface. Thomas was hammering in tent stakes when he noticed Bobby talking. Dad paused, reaching again for the flask. His hand trembled slightly. At first, Thomas thought Bobby was just playing. You know how kids talk to themselves. But then he realized Bobby's voice had that question-answer rhythm of a real conversation. Thomas asked who he was speaking to. It was completely dark outside now. The bugs kept hitting the screen door behind us. Bobby pointed across the river and said, "A boy." And there he was, a child standing on the opposite bank just watching them. Thomas said the kid was dressed all wrong for hiking. He wore clothes like from an old photograph, one of those caps kids wore in the 20s, short pants, and a buttoned shirt with the sleeves rolled up. No backpack, no water bottle, no supplies at all. I tried to picture it, this strange child appearing in the middle of nowhere, watching my uncle from across a river. The strange part was that the boy never spoke. He just gestured for Bobby to come join him on the other side. Thomas didn't like it. He approached the riverbank and called out to the kid. Dad put his mug down and stared off into space. He wasn't looking at the dark night outside my porch. He was lost in old memories. Thomas told the boy they couldn't cross that day. The current was too strong, but maybe they could meet at the bridge downstream tomorrow. He was trying to be responsible, figured the kid might be from a nearby campsite, though he hadn't seen any. The boy nodded once. Dad's voice dropped almost to a whisper. Then he walked backward into the trees, never turned around, just backed away until the forest swallowed him up. I felt goosebumps pop up on my arms as I listened. Dad took a deep breath before going on. That night, Bobby couldn't stop talking about his new friend. Thomas tried to get details. Where did the boy come from? Had Bobby seen him before? But Bobby didn't have answers, just excitement about meeting him again. Thomas felt something wasn't right about the whole thing. Why didn't he just pack up and leave? I asked. He almost did, but he told himself he was being paranoid. Bobby had been cooped up in school, and Thomas thought maybe he was just projecting his own worries. Kids make friends quickly, right? And Thomas had promised Bobby 3 days in the woods. Breaking that promise seemed worse than a strange feeling he couldn't explain. Dad's face tightened. He figured they'd check it out tomorrow, maybe meet the boy's parents and laugh about how silly his concerns had been. Dad looked at me directly now, his eyes reflecting the yellow porch light. They agreed to go back to that spot the next day, using the footbridge about half a mile south of their camp. Thomas thought that was safer than trying to wade across the river. The night insects got quiet for a moment, leaving nothing but the sound of Dad's breathing and the soft creak of his rocking chair. I waited for him to continue, but he just stared out into the darkness where the forest was. Dad sat motionless, facing the darkness for what felt like minutes. His knuckles had gone white around his coffee mug. I didn't push him to continue, understanding that he was gathering strength to tell the most difficult part of the story. The next morning, he finally said, his voice steadier than I expected. Thomas and Bobby returned to Eagle River, taking the main trail. I nodded, waiting for him to continue. When they reached the spot from yesterday, the boy was already there, sitting on the opposite bank. Bobby went wild, jumping and waving with excitement. Thomas said he'd never seen his son so enthusiastic about meeting someone. Dad took another drink, and I noticed the flask was almost empty now. Thomas reminded Bobby about using the footbridge downstream. They needed to do this properly, safely. But as they turned to walk toward the bridge, he paused, taking a deep breath. Bobby started crying. Not normal tears, but heavy, racking sobs that seemed to come from nowhere. Thomas asked what was wrong, but Bobby just kept repeating, "I need to go now. He's waiting for me." The way Dad imitated Bobby's voice gave me goosebumps, It was flat and emotionless, nothing like how a kid should sound. Thomas said Bobby's voice sounded different, like the words weren't quite his own. He grabbed Bobby's arm, trying to hold him back, but Bobby pulled away with strength no 10-year-old should have. I thought about the photograph, that small boy with pine cones in his hand. How could he overpower my grandfather? Bobby broke free and ran straight back toward the river. Thomas chased after him, calling his name over and over. He said he'd never run so fast in his life. Dad's hands were shaking now, and he placed his mug on the table to hide it. When Thomas reached the riverbank, Bobby had stopped at the water's edge. That boy was still on the opposite bank, but Thomas said, Dad's voice cracked. Thomas said he wasn't sure it was a boy anymore. What do you mean? I asked, barely above a whisper. The face had changed. Where there should have been normal eyes, there were just black holes. Not dark brown, not shadows, but black emptiness. And its smile. Dad made a gesture across his own face. The smile stretched too wide, wider than any human mouth should go. Its fingers were longer too, as it beckoned to Bobby. My stomach dropped. This wasn't just a drowning story anymore. This was something much bigger. Before Thomas could reach Bobby, the thing, the creature, let out a scream. Thomas said it was like nothing he'd ever heard, not animal, not human. It echoed through the entire forest like it was coming from everywhere at once. Dad turned toward me, his face lit up by the yellow porch light. Bobby walked into the water like he was in a trance. No hesitation, no fear of the current. Just stepped right in. Thomas reached the water's edge and dove in after him. I could picture it. The cold mountain water, the current pulling them both downstream. The river was high that year from late snowmelt. The current was stronger than Thomas expected. He kept losing sight of Bobby in the water, but he managed to grab hold of his jacket. He fought against the current, dragging them both toward the shore. Dad's focus drifted away, like he was watching old memories play out in the dark. Thomas pulled Bobby onto the riverbank. He turned him over, ready to scold him for being so reckless, but Dad's voice broke. Bobby's lips were blue. His face was blank, empty. Thomas started CPR immediately. He'd been trained for emergencies, but it didn't matter how long he tried. Bobby was gone. The night around us seemed to hold its breath. Even the insects had gone quiet. Thomas carried Bobby's body for miles, all the way back to the ranger station. He was sobbing the whole time, calling for help even though he knew it was too late. The official report ruled it an accidental drowning. They searched the area but never found any evidence of another child. Dad's hands tensed on the armrest. Thomas never told anyone the truth about what he saw. Not the police, not the other rangers. Who would believe him? A creature wearing a child's form had lured his son to his death. It would have sounded like the ravings of a grief-stricken father. Nobody spoke for a while. I thought about my grandfather keeping that secret alone for years, until he finally told my father. When I turned 18, Dad continued, Thomas told me everything. He'd spent years researching similar incidents, folklore about entities that mimic children to lure others to their death. Most of what he found was vague, but enough to convince him that whatever took Bobby wasn't human. I wrapped my arms around myself, feeling a chill even though it was a mild night. The forest beyond my porch didn't feel like home anymore. It felt dangerous, like something was out there that we couldn't explain. Dad downed the rest of his drink in one gulp. Thomas never let it happen again. He made sure no ranger families went near that part of Eagle River. When he couldn't be there himself, he had me check it. After you were born, he got even more careful. He always said it seemed to go after children with connections to the Forest Service. The woods past the porch light looked darker now. My grandfather had died still carrying this secret, passing it down to us. I'd promised to protect these woods, but now they seemed full of things they never taught us about at training. Dad reached across and took my hand. Now you know. Now I knew, and I couldn't unknow it. The Hayes family secret was mine to carry now. I sat in silence after Dad finished. What he told me felt heavy. The forest beyond my porch looked different now. I wondered what might be hiding between the trees. Dad waited, giving me time. The empty flask sat between us. He'd needed a lot to get through that story. "Grandpa believed that thing targets children from ranger families," Dad finally said. "He spent decades patrolling that area, making sure no one else encountered it." I understood my job now. This wasn't just a story, it was a handoff, a family burden passed down to protect others. "Does anyone else know?" I asked. Dad shook his head. "Just us." Thomas tried researching it, collected folklore from all over about entities that mimic children. Some Native American stories mention similar creatures, but nothing specific enough to identify what took Bobby. I thought about Grandpa's office at the old cabin. Boxes of books and journals I'd never paid attention to. His historical research had been something more urgent. Is that why he never let me near Eagle River as a kid? I asked, though I already knew the answer. He was terrified it would take you too. Dad rubbed his face with both hands. After he retired, it ate at him. The fear that he wasn't out there protecting people anymore. I think that's what started his decline. The crickets had resumed their chirping, the night continuing as if nothing had changed, but everything had. "I need to see it," I said. "The place where it happened." Dad tensed. "Sarah, not to confront anything, just to understand." I met his eyes. "If this is my responsibility now, I need to know exactly what I'm protecting people from." He nodded reluctantly. "Tomorrow then. Get some sleep first." But sleep didn't come easily that night. I lay awake staring at my ceiling, thinking about a 10-year-old boy walking into a river, about an entity with black eyes and an impossible smile waiting in the woods. When morning came, I was already dressed and making coffee when Dad appeared in my kitchen doorway. "You don't have to come with me," I told him. "Yes, I do." His voice left no room for argument. The drive to Eagle River took 40 minutes. Neither of us spoke much. Dad found his way from memory, turning onto a dirt access road that rangers used for maintenance. We parked and hiked the last mile. The river showed up through the trees, water catching sunlight and bouncing it back in pieces. It looked peaceful, ordinary, beautiful even. Birds called overhead, and the aspen leaves shook in the light breeze. "There," Dad pointed to a widening in the river. "That's where Thomas camped with Bobby." I walked to the edge, staying several feet back from the water. The opposite bank was maybe 30 feet across. I tried to picture it. A strange boy standing there. My uncle waving excitedly. My grandfather realizing something was wrong. "The official records just listed as a drowning," Dad said, his voice tight. "Thomas made sure no families ever camped here again. He'd redirect them, cite erosion concerns or wildlife activity." The water moved steadily, not caring about us or our past. I knelt down and grabbed a smooth stone from the riverbank. "I checked this area regularly after Thomas couldn't anymore," Dad continued. "Now it's your turn." I stood up, feeling connected to my family's pain and purpose. This wasn't just about honoring Grandpa's memory anymore. It was about protecting others from something they wouldn't even know to fear. "I'll need to put up new warning signs," I said, thinking out loud. "The old ones have faded." Dad nodded. "Thomas always made sure there were dangerous current signs along this stretch." "I'll add it to my regular patrol route." I turned away from the river, unable to look at it anymore. Has it ever appeared again? The entity? Thomas thought he spotted it twice over the years, both times watching ranger families with children. Dad's face had aged 10 years just standing here. It never approached them, maybe because Thomas was there. I walked back toward the trail, Dad following behind me. For decades, Grandpa had carried this burden alone, then shared it with Dad. Now it belonged to me too. That afternoon, I drove back to Eagle River with a truck full of new signs. I spent hours installing them along the riverbank. Danger, strong current, no swimming. Simple, practical warnings that people might actually heed. As I hammered the last post into the ground, I found myself speaking quietly to the forest. "I know you're out there," I said, feeling foolish but compelled. "And I'm watching too." The trees didn't answer. The river kept flowing. But I felt something, an alertness in me that I knew would stay forever. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with my Ranger notebook open. I wrote down what I did that day in Park Service talk. Replaced warning signage along Eagle River Section 12B due to weathering of previous signs. Then I made a small mark in the margin that only our family would know, a symbol Dad had shown me earlier. The Hayes family code for places with supernatural dangers. I shut the notebook and looked out my window as it got dark. The wilderness I promised to protect now felt more important and more risky. But I wasn't scared. I was determined. I would keep up the Hayes family tradition, protecting both the wilderness and its visitors from all dangers, whether you could see them or not, sworn to stop history from happening again.